Hey there, writing buddies. I'm Michael. Welcome back to my channel, Mr. Swain. Today, I'm going to be going over world building, one of my favorite topics, and one of the topics that takes a long time to really flesh out. So we're going to dive into it. I will probably do more videos on this, but I'm going to give you a bit of an overview in this one here. If you follow my TikTok, you will have probably seen my map in which you can see the entire known world for my fantasy universe I've created. The thing about that is it took me about 15 years to make that. And I'm hoping with this video that you will be able to create your fantasy world much faster than I made mine. We need to ask, what is it that makes a fantasy world? And for me, I've narrowed it down to two things. There's building blocks and then there's advanced blocks. And I'm gonna go through both of those here today so that way you can probably pick and choose whatever you wanna have as far as your world goes. But this should help out in kind of fine-tuning the world. First one, obviously we're going to start off with the building blocks. And with building blocks, just so you understand what that is, those are the fundamentals to what creates a society. World building is not about actually building the world, it's about building the people that live in the world. You could literally go to a map generator and just generate yourself a map, and that would be technically building a world. But we are not really looking to build just the topography of what our maps look like. We are looking to build the societies that live inside of those maps. That being said, the first thing that we're going to be looking at is going to be the geography. So once we have that map kind of built, we're going to start thinking about where we're placing our starting towns, our starting villages. We can even look at our own world, and you can see how cities were built with geography in mind. The geography gave the town some sort of advantage that helped it flourish. So a lot of times you might see a village, that is out on a plain because the ground there is very good for crops. You might see a town or city that's being built inside, or not really inside, but next to or on top of a mountain because it eliminates the ability for other armies to attack that town. And then of course you see a lot of large cities in our world are on a coastline or are on a waterway of some type. And the reason that those towns are on a coast or they're on a waterway is because water leads to trade. Being able to get onto a boat, take a lot of cargo from one location to another is a big deal. So having towns and cities based off of water is a very important thing to be considering whenever you're building your world. Speaking of trade, that is the second building block, and that is trade and professions. Oftentimes in the past, you would see towns and then eventually cities crop up where trade was happening. So basically, in the very beginning stages, you'd have a few different towns that have their own different production. There's sheep over here, there's farms over there, whatever it might be, and they would meet in a centralized location where kind of like the roads would meet, and they would set up shops with each other and they would trade with each other. And that might happen a couple times out of the year, then it might happen a couple times each season, and then eventually it was kind of happening all year round. And people would then just decide, there's so much trade happening here, there's so much money going on right here, I'm just gonna make a house and live right here anyways. And that way I can be part of this trade going on. I can be maybe like a broker or a middleman. And that's when you would see the rise of cities, is because you have all this trade coming in and going out, and a lot of money was exchanged in those locations. It is kind of important, especially if your story is taking place in a very early time of your world where cities have not had a lot of time to be built up, to understand how trade worked before currency was really introduced. People would trade a bushel of apples for a dress or two, whatever they felt was appropriate trades. So you would see like just actual trades of goods going back and forth. And then eventually when currency shows up, that's a very powerful tool for an economy, which I will get to later. An economy is what trade kind of morphs into, But economy, being that it is a higher level, is actually one of the advanced building blocks, which I'll talk about here in a minute. But in doing so, that will allow these villages and these towns to grow much more rapidly. Now, before we know what it is that we're actually trading, we need to know what kind of professions these towns and villages are actually having. So that's going to be things like mining, logging, like an innkeeper. All those professions are going to be showing up in every single town that we build, okay? So what we're going to be looking for are the more specific professions to the location. These professions that make up the majority of the labor force in that town or village, these are going to shape the next building block, which is family and culture. Family and culture is a bit of an odd block because, you know, as we're talking about building blocks, you would think that family is a building block to culture, but a lot of times culture actually influences how the family interacts with themselves and with other families as well. So while we're doing family and culture, this one's a little bit of a back and forth. You have to kind of understand what the culture is and how it's going to influence the family, and how the family's going to then influence the culture. It's a little bit of a weave going on here. If the culture is, you know, heavily agricultural, or if it's, you know, more militaristic, that's going to have a severe impact on the way that the family interacts at home. We want to be thinking about what types of deep-rooted traits these fundamental professions are going to have on the people in that general area. So as an example, if the culture is, or the town is built up next to or inside of a mountain, you know, they might be a mining community. And if they're a mining community, that means that they might have very strict guidelines. The reason for that is that, you know, mining is not a fun job, you know, especially when you're talking about, you know, old types of mining where you just have a pickaxe and a shovel. You know, it's very labor intensive. Not to mention, it's also dangerous. So this culture might have the mentality that this is something that we have to do in order to be of use to the economy. This might make the culture value things such as duty, strength, self-sacrifice. While on the other hand, a culture that sits next to an ocean, they might be completely different. They have different ships in the harbor that do different jobs. They have fishing ships. They've got, you know, trade vessels. So they might have a more open idea just because, like, they're not being shoehorned into one profession of mining. They have kind of more a wider array of jobs available to them. They also are growing up next to a vast ocean, so they can kind of like see that the world is very large every single day that they wake up. Because of that, they might have this more of a mentality about like endless possibilities. This type of society might value things such as adventure, commerce, personal choice. Vastly different than what we saw over in the mountain community. With these building blocks, it's good to get just a general idea. Again, we're not having to flesh things out. And this is also very true when it comes to how long your world has been in effect. You know, the longer it's been since your world started, you know, you do need to know these kind of fundamentals of like where this town kind of originated from. But if it's been, you know, 1,000, 2,000 years later, it's going to look very different. You know, they might still have some of those core values intact. They might have a few of them have been changed, but it's important to kind of understand where they came from, and that way you can kind of see what they've become much later on. Now, before I get into the advanced building blocks, if you found the video helpful at all, go ahead and leave a like down below. It'll help other authors find it as well, and I really appreciate that. Now that we've gone over the basic building blocks, let's take a look at the advanced ones. The first one I want to talk about here is religion. I place religion in the advanced building blocks, but I do it at the start because of the fact that depending on the actual town or city, religion could be a basic building block as well. It just really depends on how early the religion was ingrained into the society. You know, if you look at in the real world, a lot of our towns and cities have been conquered by some other force. And so the religion that was there maybe stayed, but also got watered down. The new religion that came in kind of morphed to adapt to the new location. So it depends on how really ingrained that religion is into the society. But for the most part, religion is a more advanced building block. All that being said, I do plan on doing a deeper dive into religion because it is a very important aspect of society, it often reaches into the heart of a society. So while it might not be one of the building factors of a society, a lot of times once a religion comes in and establishes itself, the heart of that society is then built around that religion. The main thing to look at with religion in aspect to world building is what types of core values is the religion instilling that is not being instilled by other factors. So at this point, whether or not, there's one God or multiple gods, that's not that big of a deal right now at this level that we're looking at. What we're really focusing on is what would the society look like without this religion? And what would the society look like if it was completely centered around this religion, right? If it is centered around it, if it's not centered around it, those are things to think of as well. But we want to be looking at what kind of fundamentals is this religion instilling? What are they saying is good to do? What are they saying is bad to do? These are the things that we're going to be looking at. The next two entries are neck and neck, and it's kind of, again, a weave between them. That is education and philosophy, and magic and technology. In a lot of things that I've read, the magic is, powerful and pervasive, yes, but it's also technically kind of narrow. And what I mean by that is that not everyone has access to magic or technology, so the understanding of what magic is or what technology is, what it's capable of, those things are not always generally known. I typically focus on the general population's education and philosophy first, but I still have to take into account what kind of magic and technology is commonplace. What parts of the magic or tech is, in every household? What do people just know about? Is it a workplace thing? Is it like the kingdom uses it in warfare, but it's not used in the house kind of thing? What things are known and what things are not known? As an example, in my world, everyone knows about magic. It's not a hidden thing. It's very apparent. There's a whole magic district in most cities. So it's very widely known about magic. They know that mages can, shoot fireballs, or create an orb of light. Some people might know about mind reading. Others might not know about that. Higher levels of magic, such as portal crafting, is so rare. So few mages are able to do this around the world that most people do not know that that is a thing. The common folk do not know that portals actually exist. That being said, I typically think about what are these kind of like general points of knowledge that, everyone knows. And I kind of go from there to understand, what is so pervasive about magic and technology that it's seeped into society, and what kind of effects has that had on society? Has that eroded religion? Has that enhanced the religion? Thinking about these kind of things, what kind of questions, magic and people being able to cast magic, especially what types of magic. If you only have, elemental magic, then you might not have such serious questions if you have something like chaos magic also, right? Those kinds of, those darker magics might raise questions in society as far as like, well, hey, magic users help because they're able to grow plants really fast, or they're able to lift super heavy objects that cranes couldn't lift or whatever. But they're also able to raise the dead. Should we make that illegal? Should we even allow them to teach that? Where are the limits on magic that society is placing on it? And what are the limits of magic that are kind of pushing the boundaries of society? I did another video about magic building. If you haven't seen it, go check it out. But when it comes to world building, what we're really looking at, the way I focus on magic is by looking at it as a technology. Like technologies and science, when it comes to magic, we also need to think about how it was formed. So typically, in a time of peace, magic is going to be mainly explored through the avenue of improving life, quality of life issues. For instance, in my world, mages go around and they create a block of ice for people to put in their refrigerators. So like the old, in our real world, the very first refrigerators were basically you put an ice in it. It's an ice chest for the most part. And that is what's in our world, or in my world, where they go around, they put a block of ice in there for people, and that's a service that mages do for people who are willing to pay for it. But it's a quality of life service, right? But in times of war, those same people who would normally be crafting magic for, quality of life, now they're looking at ways that they can use magic to win the war. So you're going to start seeing more destructive spells. You're going to see, maybe spells that would enhance the abilities of their comrades, So you have to think about how the society was really raised up. That might dictate a little bit of how magic was also crafted throughout the world. Now that we have the economy and the magic in place, we can really start to look at how the economy would be built. We have to think about the fact that technology and the education levels really push the economy forward. So for instance, if we have a new invention, we can use, for instance, the train. Is a good example. When the train came out, we needed fuel, and that fuel came as coal, and so therefore coal production shot through the roof. So any kind of town or city or whatnot that was really big into coal production suddenly had a surge in its need and therefore money. So those towns would then become more affluent and everything. Those towns would also be where people would want to go. They would want to move there because there's going to be more jobs there, more opportunity. So the villages would become towns, which would become cities, and so on and so forth. So it's important to think about what kind of technology you have in your world and what that technology needs in order to sustain itself. And therefore, that's going to be what is really driving your economy. One thing that I like to do with my world is kind of the idea of when the economy moves on. So you have a town that becomes a city or whatnot, and it grows up because whatever they were producing was very needed, but then the technology surpassed the need for that resource, and now the economy is drying up there. So you might have be one of the old towns that no one really goes to anymore. This might be a completely vacated ghost town now, or it could just be a town that is surviving on its laurels and it's on the downcline, right? So it's always kind of fun to play with that idea of when the economy moves on from a city. The last part of my world building comes in the form of governments. Obviously, we want to really focus on the government that our main characters are primarily dealing with, but it's also important to understand the relationship that government has with its fellow nations, right? What do the border disputes look like? What are the trade agreements looking like? Are they in a standoff right now where they're, blockading each other? How are these nations really interacting with each other on this high level of government? Oftentimes we deal with kingdoms in fantasy, but it's important to understand how the structure, like the power structure, is built underneath the throne. Our characters might need something, and it would make sense that the monarch, the king or queen, is able to give them that, whatever it is that they need. But do they really want to go speak to the monarch? Do they think they're going to have success in doing that? Maybe they would rather go to this, advisor who has the king or queen's ear, and they're going to have better success petitioning the advisor, who would then on their behalf go petition the monarch, right? So understanding how these structures are built can really affect how the story would really play out. Is it the king or queen ruling with an iron fist? Do the guilds or the merchants, do they really rule the city because they have so much money and they control the trade? Who really holds the keys of power? Remember, these are all things that we want to keep in mind as we're building our world. We don't need to know everything. We don't need to have 5,000 years mapped out for every single little town. That comes later. But when your story moves from one location to another, it is important to have this kind of fundamental understanding of the location that they're going into. That will help you paint a more vivid location, a more vivid experience, and it's going to also definitely affect the experience that they are having in there, right? If they go from a seafaring city over to a mining colony, they're going to have a much different experience, and understanding what the core values are of this new location will not only affect how the story goes, but it's also really going to add to the tension and drama of the story as well. Let me know down in the comments below what your favorite fictional world is, and if you have any kind of tips on world building, I'd love to hear them. Subscribe to the channel for more writing tips, and until next time, happy writing, happy reading.